Hello, and welcome to today's live reading of No Names to Be Given by Julia Brewer Daly, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. A child born to another woman calls me mommy. The magnitude of that tragedy and the depths of that privilege are not lost on me. Jody Launders. Prologue. Magnolia Home Hospital, New Orleans, 1966. Men loved Sandy's body. She didn't have the option of leading with her wit or intellect. Her looks arrived first. It was both a blessing and a curse. Now, Sandy placed her hand on her formerly taut stomach. It felt bloated and mushy. How long would it be before she was back in her sparkly dance costumes and performing for audiences? The provocative bustiers and garter belts would not fit her now. She slid up in her hospital bed and peered through a crack in the curtain. They were all in the same recovery room, separated by thin blue fabric. She heard the other two moaning as they awakened. A nurse worked among the three of them and whispered, as if the others were out of earshot, "What a coincidence y'all went into labor on the same day. We were inducing you next week." An acidic smell of disinfectant and the rusty odor of blood invaded Sandy's nostrils. She swallowed and found her throat parched and lips chapped. Her head throbbed with a dull drum beat, and she tasted a metallic tang. What have I done? What did I think? Why did I think this was the better choice? Sandy's thoughts jumbled like a bad movie looping in her head. She squeezed her eyes shut as she remembered how her heart once pounded whenever she heard Glenn's voice. The curtain separating the roommates' beds reminded Sandy of those in her home in Illinois, and her mind projected Glenn's image into the hospital room. "You see what happens to trashy girls?" She imagined him sitting at the end of the bed, sneering at her. Sandy's teeth chattered and her body quaked in small jerks. Her chest rose and fell so rapidly she became faint. Sandy imagined dying in the hospital. Women died from childbirth all the time. Would her mother ever find out? Probably not. Sandy covered her tracks pretty well. Glenn would think she got what she deserved. "Becca?" Sandy leaned forward and yanked back the cloth separating them. Becca twisted from side to side. Sandy hated seeing her roommate in such distress. Becca might have been a princess-like creature in her former life, but Sandy admired her rebellious streak. How many other white girls had the guts to fall in love with a Negro? Becca broke the silence. "I cannot believe our babies are in the nursery down the hall, and they won't let us see them," she whispered. "Maybe we can sneak down there." "Don't. It may make things worse." Sandy wanted to avoid all maternal feelings and didn't want to see a child who might look like her or Carlos. "I can barely walk to the bathroom," Faith's voice trembled. Her pixie haircut, unwashed and dishwater blonde, was in spikes, and her eyes seemed too large for their sockets. "Hey, Nurse Carter, if you let me go to the nursery, I won't bother you anymore." "You know that's not allowed," the nurse frowned at Becca. "I promise to stand behind the window. I just want to see my baby. One time, I promise." The nurse's response was to leave the room. Becca whispered to Sandy, "I just want to see the skin color. I want to see if the adoptive parents will know it's a mixed race baby." Most of all, Sandy knew she longed to hold her child. Becca still declared love for her baby's father. Sandy was still in love with her child's father, too, but he would be no help to her from behind prison bars. "I'll go on a hunger strike. Do you want me to barricade myself in the nursery?" Becca made her announcements in a loud voice. "Hush, you're disturbing the entire home." Nurse Carter poked her head back in the doorway and spoke harshly. Perspiration beaded in the hollows of Becca's cheeks, and Sandy watched as she swiped it away with her palm. Her beauty dulled only slightly with her auburn hair in a messy knot on the top of her head and her freckles dominant on her ivory skin. Becca's startling blue eyes were now the color of a very stormy sea, gunmetal and glinting. "Everything's going to be all right," Sandy cooed. She feared Becca would spring from the bed and run toward the nursery. Sandy watched Faith with her hands clasped up as if in a prayer. "Faith, are you okay?" She always spoke to Faith as if she were a child. They were all about the same age, 18, but Faith's innocence made her seem so much younger. "I'm miserable," Faith said. "Me too. I feel like a medieval torture device stretched my limbs," Sandy said. Faith chanted prayers for her baby. "Please, Lord, please let my baby have the very best parents. I know you'll take care of him or her." She hummed the lyrics of "Jesus Loves the Little Children." "Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight." How are we expected to walk away and pretend nothing happened? They knocked us out before we had our babies and won't let us see them. We don't even know if we had a boy or a girl, Becca blurted out. Sandy did not turn to Becca. Instead, she watched Faith twist her hands. Faith's frame disappeared from view under the sheet. Sandy was afraid her tiny limbs, awkward and knobby, would vanish altogether without the bed to contain her. Every time Sandy looked at Faith, she remembered Faith's description of her assault. Now, a living reminder of it existed. Faith had said she didn't want this baby carrying the blame for its conception. Suddenly, Faith began gulping breaths like drinking water with a cupped hand from a bucket. Sandy tried not to look at her own reflection in the mirror. Her hair, not dyed since entering the home, showed roots black and wide like a stripe of paint against a hot asphalt roadway. Only in reverse, her platinum locks clung to the dark center. Towering above Faith, she saw how sallow her skin was and how lackluster. She needed her eyebrows plucked and her nails painted. No time to worry about all that. Sandy required all her strength for her own recovery and assisting her friends. She tucked Faith and Becca's blankets around them, raised their hospital bed rails, and crawled back into bed. Tomorrow, they had plans to make. Part 1. Chapter 1, Sandra Reynolds, Morton, Illinois, 1964. Sandra always sauntered through her house as though she were on a stage. Even as a young child, she pretended she was an actress like Elizabeth Taylor or a dancer like Ginger Rogers. Quit sashaying around this house, her mother would say, and wipe that lipstick off your mouth. Leave her alone, Mama. She's learning to be a girl. Her daddy always took her side. She remembered when his strong arms tossed her into the air. She could not stop giggling. He taught her how to set a catfish line in the river and to plant tomatoes. Remember, there's no shame in hard work, whatever it is, he'd say when she complained about sweating and wiped her dirty hands on a tattered plaid shirt. She was 15 when he died, and her world tumbled end over end as his tractor did when it tipped over the bluff on a tenant farm in Illinois. Her father was in the rocky grave only a few days before Glenn, a hired hand for the neighbor next door, approached her mother, Peggy. Glenn smoothly talked Peggy into letting him move into their house. He told her not to worry about paying the bills they owed or buying groceries. Sandra fumed at her mother for allowing someone else in to take her daddy's place so soon, but she realized her mother was desperate. They had no money and neither of them had a job. Soon after Glenn moved into their home, Sandra stood on the porch's edge and watched as he dragged a kitten from under the house. A stray cat had given birth to 3 babies under the steps and died before she could nurse them. 2 of the kittens had already perished, the remaining one twisted in Glenn's enormous hands. Glenn was a gangly man, like his body parts were stolen by grave robbers and stitched together like a Frankenstein's monster. He had large hands and feet, but skinny legs and a tiny head. A dome of jet black hair was hidden under an old straw cowboy hat, but a strand seemed to always hang in his eyes. What are you doing with that kitten? Sandra knew that most stray cats ended up in a burlap sacks in the creek. I need you keeping him alive. He can live in the barn when he's strong enough, Glenn whispered to the form in his grasp. You're a fighter. You can do this. Sandra had not seen this gentleness from Glenn. The night before, she screamed when he twisted Peggy's arm behind her back. He had tossed his plate on the floor and stalked from the house. Was this an apology for the way he treated them? She stumbled forward and swept the tiny gray creature from him. The pitiful mewing from the little thing encouraged her. In the kitchen, she poured milk into a dish and dipped a cloth, dampening it. Holding it to the cat's mouth, she grinned as it sucked on the fabric. I'll get an eyedropper to make it easier, Glenn said. Sandra nodded. What had come over Glenn? Sandra didn't think he had a nice bone in his body. Maybe he just needed help with the rats in the barn, where he spent most of his time. Every night since he moved in, Glenn drank clear, hard liquor he made behind the barn. He was a mean drunk. Neither she nor her mother could please him. A week later, Sandra arrived home from school, and found a purple bruise glowing on her mother's cheek. If he hits you again tonight, I'll kill him. Sandra's words held a false bravado. She feared him too. Hush, he don't mean it. I burnt his supper last night. Glenn stayed outside later and later. It was difficult for her mama to keep supper warm without getting it overcooked. Glenn was mad when the food was cold and madder if she burnt it. There's no excuse. Let's get away from here, Sandra pleaded. Where would we go? Her mother said, eyes downcast. We ain't got nothing. As if to confirm her mother's statement, a breeze blew through the cracks around the windows and stirred the blue cotton cloth that divided their one-room house. The fabric hung from ropes separating the kitchen from corners where cotton mattresses lay on the floor. After her father's death, Sandra had slept with her mother until Glenn arrived. Then she dragged her bedding near the back door. At midnight, Sandra lay on her mattress, trying to sleep. She placed her hands over her ears and a pillow over her head. The house was too small, and she heard every conversation. Why are you here if you don't want to help us? You and that brat of yours are lucky I take care of you. Take care of us? You're just another mouth to feed. Chandra heard a slap and a whimper. The image of Peggy blocking her face from Glenn's smack played the rest of the night in Sandra's head. Peggy's pitiful smashed fingers raised in defense against a bully. Earlier that afternoon, Sandra was hanging wet clothes on the wire line behind the house when she heard her mother cry out. Their washing machine was one of the old crank types on the back screened porch. Her mother often caught her hand in the rollers as she pressed clothes through the device and smashed fingers or broke her nails. Oh, get me a cloth, her mother cried, and rusty metal grinding to a halt signified another accident. Sandra grabbed a flour sack towel from the sink and ran to the back porch. Her mother was seated on the floor, clutching her hand and rocking back and forth. Here, let me wrap your hand. Sandra's stomach curdled like buttermilk. Peggy's index and middle fingers looked like ground beef. We're going to take you to the hospital. Poor people don't go to the hospital. Her mother's face was pinched and pale with pain. Sandra's own face felt like it matched her mother's grimace. Sandra awoke early and tiptoed out of the house. She didn't care if she waited 2 hours for the bus. She wouldn't be around when Glenn woke up. When the bus finally arrived, Sandra jumped down from the rail fence and climbed aboard. She heaved herself into a seat next to a boy who smiled when she sat down. Sandra basked in the boys' admiration when they told her she was beautiful. Stan Gentry was seated behind her and pulled a copy of his favorite motorcycle magazine out of his jacket. His excitement was unmistakable as he pointed to the photo. Look, this girl looks exactly like you. Well, I guess she does, Sandra nodded and examined the photo. A woman with long legs and ragged jean shorts and a tight white t shirt waxed a Harley Davidson. She was the favorite calendar girl for all the service station mechanics in town. The model could have been her twin. Should she feel ashamed for boys liking her body? Sandra tossed her head and sat a little straighter. She didn't do anything to get her looks, but she might as well use what she had. The school was an escape for her, but time passed too quickly, and that afternoon she was back at home listening to yet another argument while sitting on the porch swing. Sandra eavesdropped on her mama and Glenn fighting about tenant payments on the farm. The walls of her house were as thin as paper, and their voices were loud and angry. Before moving into their house, Glenn had labored for Mr. Jenkins on the farm next to theirs. Mr. Jenkins owned the land where they lived too, but Glenn became lazy when he took over planting corn on their place. He produced scarcely enough for the liquor he made. Glenn made money handing out mason jars to the men who drove their pickups behind the barn, but Sandra noticed he kept it for himself. She learned from her mother's raised voice that Glenn had not paid Mr. Jenkins the amount owed from tenants. Instead, Glenn had offered Sandra's mother, Peggy, as Mr. Jenkins' cook because Mr. Jenkins' wife had run away with one of his hired men. Peggy would prepare dumplings or a stew each week, something that would last Mr. Jenkins a few days. Her mother was not happy about the arrangement, but had no choice since their house was tied to delinquent payments. Once a week, Sandra watched as Glenn counted out money into her mother's hand. You buy what you need to cook for Jenkins. The slop you're feeding me is not worth the dough I give you. Sandra's eyes narrowed as she watched her mother cringe. One night during the hot summer before her senior year, Sandra carried an oak basket with a chicken pie and baked sweet potatoes across the furrowed, red dirt field to deliver Mr. Jenkins's supper. When she returned home, Glenn eyed a $5 bill in her hand. What's that? Glenn said. $5, Sandra mumbled, trying to stuff the money into her jeans pocket. What's he giving you money for? He's just trying to be nice. He's trying to get in your pants. Glenn grabbed her arm and twisted it. When she squealed, he let her go. You're not going over there again. Glenn made Sandra feel shaky inside. She wondered if anyone noticed when she was around him that her face flushed as if she held it over a tea kettle. The only attention she received at home was the wrong kind. She searched for what she assumed was the right kind with clumsy, pimple-faced boys in their cars' back seats. All the high school boys knew Glenn was vicious, so they picked up Sandra on the country road at her mailbox. She resisted their pawing and panting at first, but they were so easily thrilled. She learned how far she would allow them before she stopped their explorations. Later that fall, Sandra passed Glenn on the porch. You're not wearing that blouse. You look like a tramp. That's all boys need is to see you like that. Glenn snatched at her arm and tore the sleeve. Fiery anger blossomed inside her, as red as the blouse itself. Seething, she'd run back into the house. Glenn made the hair on her arms stand on end.